Okay. In this presentation, I would like to talk about some Islamic residences in Yemeni commentaries to Maimonides' guide. I will first give some brief, I think, necessary introduction concerning the Jews of Yemen, particularly their intellectual history of the Jews of Yemen in the medieval period, and then uh, again some necessary preliminaries concerning Maimonides' guide, after which I will have a fairly in-deep look at three examples. So, to begin with, uh, the geographical location of Yemen plays a role here because of its position on the major trade route between Egypt and India. The people of Yemen were able to be in contact with east and west and north and south, and receive receive books and ideas from all over the world at the time. And it was indeed in the medieval period, Yemen was a very vibrant intellectual climate. Jews, Muslims, several different sects or brands of Muslims, Ismailis, Zayidis, Mu'tazila even, were flourishing there. And the Jews avidly studied literature by both Jewish and non-Jewish authors. They received the Jewish authors from the Gaonim in Babylon and centers in Egypt, but they were exposed to and had no problem studying and absorbing a good deal of material by non-Jewish authors, Jewish authors from India, Central Asia, Egypt, and elsewhere. And one should mention or stress in particular the role of the Ismailis. Yemen was at the time the stronghold of the Ismailis, particularly due to the fact of the close connections between Egypt and Yemen. Yemen, Egypt being ruled until 1171 by the Fatimids, a Shia dynasty with a strong connection to Ismaili theology. And Ismaili theology and the Ismaili brand of Islam is very strongly rooted in falsafa, that's to say, in the Hellenistic philosophy, uh, basically what's called the Neoplatonism in our own day, uh, which informs their ideas of emanation, prophecy, and others. And the Ismailis are also relatively tolerant of Jews, and the Jews and Ismailis were able to have, I think, a dialogue in which each learned from the other. Now, Moses Maimonides, who was born in Al-Andalus in the fourth decade of the 12th century, in the 1130s, and died in Egypt in 1204, wrote his guide, his philosophy, his philosophical chef d'oeuvre. He actually wrote it over a long period of time. He had drafts of various books that he was planning to write and decided not to write, but he incorporated these drafts into what eventually became known as his Guide of the Perplexed, Dalalat al-Fa'irin, book written in Judeo-Arabic and which draws heavily upon Islamic sources. It's clear that his probably greatest influence of the Muslim thinker for whom he had the highest regard was Abu Nasr al-Farabi, but he also had a deep study of Kalam in order to refute the position of the Kalam, or the positions of the Kalam, which had made great inroads among some Jews. And he wrote it in an elusive style. This is not to say that he's simply lying and telling you who believes something when he doesn't, which is what, unfortunately, a lot of people seem to interpret his so-called esotericism. He wrote in an elusive style because you have to work hard to get at the answer, and some of these very subtle philosophical issues don't have answers that can be phrased in clear and unambiguous fashion in any language. All you can do is guide, as he does, guide the reader towards the right direction. But because of the elusive style of the guide, which he stresses in his preface, the book invites commentary. Now, the Maimonides Guide is possibly the most important book of Jewish philosophy ever written, but its major impact was in its Hebrew translation, the Moreh Nevuchim, translated by Shmuel ibn Tibon. Not too many communities had or individuals that we know of were actually reading the guide in the original, but one community which studied the guide and absorbed it, actually since it's from its publication into the 20th century, was the community of Yemen, studied the guide in its original language. You can imagine that a book that relies so heavily on precise and at the same time elusive phrasing will lose a lot in translation. So it's very significant that the Yemenites are reading the book in the original and also commenting upon it in the original. In fact, all the Jewish commentaries to the guide in Arabic come from the Yemen. And a very important and little studied commentary by a Muslim, Al-Nimi, also comes from the Yemen. There's one commentary and a part of the guide written by a Muslim from outside the Yemen, but basically the corpus of Arabic commentaries relating to the Judeo-Arabic original of the guide comes from the Yemen. My first example comes from the commentary by Zechariah Harofei, a very prolific Yemeni author of the mid-15th century, and you have here on the screen an image from one of the manuscripts of his commentary. Now, the guide was written, as Maimonides tells us, for a Jew who has begun to study philosophy and has absorbed the critically important fact or notion that the deity, the Jewish conception of God, is totally immaterial, is not made of matter, and has no attributes or characteristics that necessarily belong to matter. Yet the Bible and some rabbinic literature speaks of God in material terms, even in human terms, attributing to God human features or material features. And so Maimonides' strategy is, in the first part of the book, is to show that all these Hebrew words, which seem to speak of the deity in material terms, are equivocal. That is to say, they have more than one meaning. And when these words are applied to God, we should always choose the meaning that has no connection to matter. So in chapter 40, he discusses the Hebrew word ruach, wind or spirit, and this word, written in Judeo-Arabic, can actually be read as the Arabic homonym ruh. Now, Zechariah's commentary is not really a commentary. That is, he doesn't quote Maimonides and expand on Maimonides. He, in fact, rewrites the chapter, as he does in some of these chapters, sort of beginning where Maimonides left off, and going further into exploring the immaterial, or spiritual, if you wish, meanings that these terms have. And in doing so, he cites a very famous verse in the Quran, verse number 85 in Surah Al-Isra. So, here's what Zechariah has to say in this portion of his rewriting this chapter of the guide. I should like to call your attention to an issue that has troubled me for years. Questions and answers have been proposed about it. It says, they should ask you about the ruh, then say it is something divine, far from the command of my Lord, and you have been given but little knowledge. The amr, which in Arabic can mean both something, amr Rabbi, something divine, or command is a ambiguous term, and there's a important history to this, the phrases using amr Rabbi, amr Allah, but we won't go into that right now. So notice that Zechariah doesn't recognize this, doesn't seem to be aware that the statement he's citing comes from the Quran. It's a very close paraphrase. يَسَلُونَكَ عَلَى الرُّوحِ قُلْ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. very famous verse. He doesn't seem to know of it as a verse from the Quran, but it's possible that he knew it was from the Quran and didn't want to say it, but it's also possible that he had heard of it in any number of ways and considered it to be some sort of not folk saying, but wise saying. The collections, there are many collections of nawadir, of the wise sayings of the philosophers of old, and perhaps that's what he thought what the source was. But he does know about the literature that has grown up about this verse, the literature in the form of questions and answers, which is a very common, a very popular genre in the Yemen, Jews and Muslims. You pose your own question, you set up yourself to give the answer you want to give. So you ask a question. It's not a dialogue. It's the author's choice to express his views in the forms of questions and answers. And Zachariah apparently knows of the literature of this sort concerning this verse, but says nothing about it. Now, I mentioned earlier that there are several editions or versions of this commentary by Zachariah, a long version and a short version, and there are some interesting changes. In particular, one phrase in which he, at one version, one edition of his commentary, he attributes it to Ghazali, the very famous Muslim theologian and philosopher and legist. But elsewhere, the same remark occurs without Ghazali's name being mentioned. Now, this commentary concerns a puzzling or difficult dictum found in the Talmud. As I said, Maimonides in the guide wants to explain not only difficult biblical verses, but also difficult statements of the rabbis. And one of them is a statement which says that the world lasts 6,000 years, and 1,000 years it is a waste, which Maimonides finds difficult because in his understanding and the point of view that he works very hard to get across in the first part of Book 2 of the guide, the world was created. It has a beginning in time, but it doesn't necessarily have to come to an end. It can go on forever. And so Maimonides cites this dictum in Guide 229 and explains that his view that since we can measure the time that it supposedly lays waste 1,000 years, then it can't be the world has not simply ceased to exist. Because in order to measure time, according to Aristotelian definition, that time is the revolution of the orb. You need some sort of, now we measure time by waves within an atom. You need some sort of material substance which does something with regularity, and that's your measure for time. So if we can measure 1,000 years of it laying waste, it means that something in the universe still exists, and that's enough for him. But Zechariah takes us in a very different direction. That this Talmudic statement refers not to the cosmos, but to the human body. And the 6,000 and 1,000 is pretty much an allegory for the so-called 7 ages of man. A very, as we know, I'm not sure how Zechariah knew it, but we know is a very common theme that goes back to the Greeks. Now, what's interesting is that in the shorter version of the commentary, Zechariah attributes this explanation of this idea of the ages of man to the venerable Sheikh, the most awesome philosopher, our Lord and Master Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Ghazali, known as Al-Tusi, and I've, for reasons of space and time, brought only some of the praises and komia that he lavishes on Ghazali. But in the longer version, he brings the exact same notion of the ages of man, but anonymously. He simply says that this is something that is in accord with what has been clarified in natural science. Now, I think the version that mentions Ghazali must have been written earlier. In other words, I find it hard to believe that he thought this to be a sort of well-known, commonly accepted, widely diffused notion in natural science, and then later on at some point decided that actually the sources are Ghazali. And as a matter of fact, I haven't been able to find any discussion of the ages of man in the writings of Ghazali. Whereas I think it's possible, it's more likely that at one point he cites Ghazali as a source, and then he decided to drop the reference. And here I would propose two possible explanations. One is that, as I said, he eventually realized that this notion which he had gotten so enthused about uh, is not really a innovation, something new contributed by Ghazali, but a very well-known idea in science and medicine. Alternatively, he may simply have decided that he would draw too much criticism by mentioning Ghazali with such lavish praise, and decided to drop his name, which may actually tie in with his perhaps suppressing the Quranic origin of the verse in the previous passage that we discussed. And we have some uh, we have one text which I published in the Proceedings of the American Academy of Jewish Research, which indicates that there was some controversy in the Yemen, not quite the type of thing that we had with the Maimonidean controversies in Europe, but it's possible that there was some opposition to using non-Jewish sources, and this is again a matter of speculation, but something I'm simply suggesting at this point in time. Well, my third and final example concerns this phrase, this Quranic phrase, Khalifatullah fi ardihi, which is found in a different commentary, an anonymous commentary to the guide, one which also was written by a Yemeni Jew whose name we don't know. So this comment concerns the second part of the guide, chapter 40, where Maimonides is putting forward his very well-developed theory of prophecy. One of the tasks of the prophets, and particularly of the prophet of Judaism, Moses, is to bring to the community a law code, the Torah, in the case of Judaism. Now, law codes are necessary, according to Maimonides, because the great natural disparity among humans with regard to behavior makes it mandatory for there to be a set of laws which curb violence and injustice. As you know, throughout history, beginning from the Greeks and through the Islamic period into modern times, of the debate between the anarchists and the Darwinians, there have been two very divergent or opposite theories of human social behavior. One says that if left to our own, humans will naturally cooperate and will help each other, will not harm each other, and so there's no real need for government and laws which only get in the way. On the other hand, there is the pessimistic view of the Darwinians and Hobbes and those before him, who say, no, left to our own, it's the law of the jungle, we'll eat each other alive, and therefore we need a very strict law code to regulate human behavior and prevent people from causing harm to one another. Maimonides is in that camp of the pessimistic view, and then he says we need a law code in order to keep people in line and prevent them from hurting one another. Now, this so-called pessimistic view seems also to have been popular among Shia, and the Shia, by way of these communities, were very influential among Yemeni Jews, but they also had an impact which is not always appreciated upon Maimonides. Now, in the course of expounding a very long and interesting comment on this chapter, which I published with Hebrew translation in one of the recent issues of Da'at, the commentator says the world must be governed, and indeed there is order in the world. The world needs to be governed, and we can see that something has been done to bring order to the world. And the one responsible for this order, is God's Caliph on his earth, Khalifatullah fi ardihi, who is the prophet, because by his mediation, the people are guided to success in this world and the next. Now the phrase, Khalifatullah fi ardihi, God's Caliph, appears twice in the Quran, once in connection to Adam, the first human, and once referring to King David. And I would think that the commentator here has more in mind the second reference. It's, in the context, it's clear that he's referring, of course, to Moses as being Khalifatullah, Khalifatullah, but who was a prophet. In the Jewish tradition, Moses was also a king. Vahi B'Shuan Melech, that refers to Moses. But it's again an interesting example of the application of very characteristic and Quranic and loaded Quranic phrase to Moses. So these are the three examples. I have more, and we could go on, but time is out. So thank you for listening, and of course you can write your comments if you wish. Thank you very much. Toda Rabah, shukran jazilan, and you're welcome to put your comments down if you wish.